What if the Dolphins drafted Matt Ryan in 2008? I'm surprised how very little I have heard about this theory, especially considering that it would, make some sense and a more rational draft pick possible, but it didn't happen, and I figured it would be interesting to talk about. So, let's get into it. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if? An NFL theory. After the 2007 season, the Dolphins hit rock bottom. They started off 0-13 and ended up finishing 1-15, which was the worst record in franchise history, with one of the worst offenses in the league. And of course, they ended up with the #1 overall pick, which had some really good players, the first top 5 picks in that draft. And one of them was a quarterback, which the Dolphins, after Dan Marino retired almost a decade earlier, they have not found that successful heir apparent to him. And this time, it was Matt Ryan. However, the Dolphins surprisingly took offensive lineman Jake Long, and 2 picks later, the Falcons would take Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan, of course, would become the franchise quarterback for the Falcons ever since, and still to this day after 2018 has led the Falcons to multiple playoff appearances, including making it to the Super Bowl, in 2018. Meanwhile, for the Dolphins, Jake Long would be a very good player for him, making it a Pro Bowl every single year almost with the Dolphins. However, he would eventually be cut by them after 2012, and it would be in 2012 when they finally got their supposed franchise quarterback in Ryan Tannehill. However, later on, many years down the line, it's starting to look like he's not going to be the case much longer either. So 20 years later, almost since Dan Marino retired, the Dolphins still have not found that future franchise quarterback. But what if they did not make that mistake, and what if they took Matt Ryan in the draft? Let's get into it. It's the 2008 draft, and the Dolphins this time make the smart decision, and they take Matt Ryan with the #1 overall pick. Now, of course, the question is, what would happen with the Falcons? After all, Michael Vick was still going to be in prison for a year, so they still don't have a quarterback for the year. Now, the only good quarterback remaining in the first round was Joe Flacco, but there's no way he's that good enough to be for the 3rd overall pick. So, the Falcons are kind of screwed in that regard when it comes to quarterback. So, perhaps they would take Jake Long instead, funny enough. And later on in the 2nd round, they would get their quarterback, this time for just a year possibly, in Chad Henne, who was the quarterback that the Dolphins took in the 2nd round. But since they took Matt Ryan, they have no need for him. And then another thing I'm sure a lot of people are going to probably bring up, what about Chad Pennington? Of course, he was the Jets quarterback at the time, who was traded to the Dolphins after the Jets picked up Brett Favre. I think he would just be let go instead. He was up there in age. He suffered numerous injuries. I think he would just be let go. Maybe someone will pick him up, or he'll just retire. I don't think he would have that much significance, even though he did have a great 2008 season. But hey, Dolphins now got Matt Ryan. The Falcons got their temporary quarterback for 2018, Chad Henne, and hope for the best. Matt Ryan would generate a lot of excitement for the Dolphins, as everyone hopes he is finally the replacement for Dan Marino 10 years later. And he plays good for a rookie. However, statistically, he wasn't really that much different from Chad Pennington that year in 2008. And of course, remember that 2008 Dolphins team was mostly based on that Wildcat offense. So in the end, the Dolphins do not change, as they still end up finishing the 11-5, 10-win turnaround that they had in our timeline. Meanwhile, for the Falcons, it's not good. Without Matt Ryan, Chad Henne is not good at all. He's not ready to be an NFL starting quarterback. It trades, he's benched and back and forth throughout the entire season, and the entire Falcons team is just a mess. And they ended up finishing a disappointing 5-11, only winning 1 extra game from last year, and nowhere near making a playoff appearance. Nothing changes on the AFC side of the playoffs in the updated 2008 stands. However, the NFC side changes a lot, since the Falcons aren't making the playoffs, the Panthers win an extra game, so they now get home field advantages. The Giants fall to the 2nd seed, and the Bears actually sneak in and get the 5th seed to replace the Falcons. Since I think Matt Ryan would play no different than Chad Pennington, the Ravens still would beat the Dolphins, and with that, the AFC side remains the same, and the Steelers would be in the Super Bowl still, and the wild card round would probably be the same on the NFC side, as I don't think the Bears could beat the Cardinals in Glendale. After the Giants beat the Cardinals, as I said many times before in numerous series, the Eagles would then destroy the Panthers in the divisional round, which sets up the NFC Championship being the Eagles at the Giants, which of course the Eagles will win that just like they did in our timeline. And Super Bowl 43 is the all-Pennsylvania showdown we almost had, the Steelers and the Eagles. The Eagles, of course, beat the Steelers earlier in the year when they hosted them. And the Eagles were red hot at this time in the playoffs. Remember, they just barely lost to the Cardinals when they had to make a giant comeback and almost pulled it off. And remember, the Cardinals almost beat the Steelers too, and the Eagles were a better team. And they beat the Steelers too, so I think the Eagles would get this, and they would get their 4th title after 48 years of waiting. It's now 2009, and the Falcons, of course, without a quarterback, and they have no interest in bringing back Michael Vick, they need to get a quarterback. Thankfully, the 2009 draft is much more nice in that regard in terms of getting their quarterback. Unfortunately for them, they can't get Matthew Stafford, the best quarterback, since the Lions still take him, nor can they get Mark Sanchez, as the Jets still make the trade with the Browns to get him. So all that's left is Josh Freeman. And the Falcons this time around, even though Freeman is not close to the spot that the Falcons would take him at normally, like 10 picks lower than he was in our timeline, the Falcons would just take the bullet and just take him to be the replacement of Michael Vick. Now, of course, this means what happens with the Buccaneers, since they can't draft Josh Freeman now? Well, they probably would stick with their original plan that they did those bunch of years at the end of Gruden's time, and have a journeyman be the starter. After all, they did have Byron Leftwich be the starter in the season before Josh Freeman starts, so the Buccaneers will have to wait another year before they can get their franchise quarterback. After the incredible 2008 season, the Dolphins are extremely excited as they have Super Bowl aspirations now, seeing as they're hosting the game too, and Matt Ryan is looking to be better in his sophomore season. However, he struggles and the Dolphins struggle as he misses a few games due to injury. However, statistically, just like in 2008, he was really no different from Chad Pennington or Chad Henne in 2009, so in the end, the Dolphins still remain the same record as they finish 7-9, lose 4 more games, and miss the playoffs still. Meanwhile, down in Atlanta, the Falcons most likely would start with Chad Henne at the beginning of the year. However, when he continues to not show he's not starting quarterback material, Josh Freeman finally comes in, and he's not really that good. But thankfully, the Falcons' defense got a little bit better this year, and they still had some offensive talent, so it wasn't too bad. This was probably the best Falcons team in the last few years, but in the end, they ended up finishing the same 5-11 record they had last year, leaving Mike Smith in the hot seat going into 2010. Meanwhile, down in Tampa, it's just an absolute disaster. This was just a lame duck year for the Buccaneers no matter what, but without having Josh Freeman, any shred of decency they had during the season was gone once he was not drafted. And in the end, the Buccaneers completely fall off. After going 9-7, they finished 1-15 as one of the worst teams in the league. In the end, only one change would happen for the 2009 playoffs, as it would now be the Texans beating the Ravens in the tiebreaker, which would allow them to make the playoffs for the first time in their 7-year history. Since nothing changed on the NFC side, it's still the Saints that make the Super Bowl. Then in the wild card in the AFC side, with the Texans making their first playoff game at the Patriots, which is a rematch from just the previous week when they hosted the Patriots to get into the playoffs. The Patriots would, of course, get their revenge and beat the Texans, since they did not have the same defensive power as the Ravens did when they destroyed the Patriots. And with that, the Patriots then visit the Chargers, where the Chargers would beat them. And the AFC Championship is now the Chargers at the Colts, and one hell of a matchup that we did not get. In the end, the Colts had struggled against the Chargers when they host them. Didn't matter where they play it, and I think it would continue as the Chargers would beat the Colts and make it back to the Super Bowl after 15 years. So, Super Bowl 44 down in Miami is now the Chargers and the Saints. Wouldn't that be something? Drew Brees going up against his former team. That would be something. However, I think in the end, despite the Chargers maybe being a little bit better, I think in the end it was just the Saints' year. With the #1 offense in the league and a very opportunistic defense, I think the Saints would get it still. It's now 2010, and the Buccaneers are hoping that they would get a very high draft pick with that 115 record. That way they can get Sam Bradford, most likely, hopefully for them. Unfortunately, that dream would be shattered when the Rams, who also finished 1-15 as they both tied for the same record, would have the tiebreaker. So the Rams, with that number one overall pick, would still take Sam Bradford, leaving the Buccaneers once again without a quarterback, as the only other first-round pick was Tim Tebow, but he was nowhere near good enough to be the second overall pick. So the Buccaneers are shit out of luck once again, as they would probably take Ndamukong Suh away from the Lions instead, and of course have to wait another year before they can get their franchise quarterback. After the disappointing 2009 season, Matt Ryan and the Dolphins looked ready to finally make a playoff push once again in 2010. And oh my God, did they deliver. The Dolphins with a pounding, stinging defense, and Matt Ryan finally getting himself in position as one of the best quarterbacks in the league, put up the best season of his career, and the Dolphins surprised the AFC side of the playoffs as they finish an incredible 13-3, their best record since their 1984 season. And they look very scary going into the playoffs. Big things also happened down in Atlanta as Josh Freeman, the second year, all of a sudden becomes a comeback kid. Leads the Falcons to numerous comebacks during the season with strong offensive play and a really good defense. And the Falcons surprised the league themselves as they finished 11-5 and right there in the playoff mix in the NFC South. Meanwhile, down in Tampa Bay, as the Buccaneers still don't have their quarterback and their offense continues to struggle, but their defense, I mean to say, is really, really good, especially with Ndamukong Suh, who is like the defensive rookie in the year, wrecking the entire NFC side of the league up with all the sacks and the tackles. The Buccaneers improved to 5-11, and they look really good, and they just need to get that quarterback to finally be in position to maybe make a playoff push in 2011. In the updated 2010 standings, every side of the playoffs changed a lot, as the Ravens now get the 2nd seed, as the Steelers fall all the way down to the 6th seed, as the Dolphins, despite being 13-3, would not win the AFC East, so they had to be the 5th seed in the playoffs. Meanwhile, on the NFC side, it's now the Saints with the #1 seed, the Packers get the #2 seed, the Rams actually win the NFC South with an 8-8 record, as the Falcons fall to the 5th seed, and the Giants get into the playoffs as the 6th seed. The playoffs would begin with one interesting matchup despite the record, as the Falcons visit the Rams. Josh Freeman going against the rookie quarterback Sam Bradford. The Falcons beat the crap out of the Rams during the regular season when they visited them. However, this time the Rams play much, much better. But down, need a score to win it. Freeman and the Falcons march downfield and continue to keep the comebacks going as they go on and beat the Rams in the wild card. Followed by the Steelers beating the Colts in a defensive struggle. And then after that, it would be the Dolphins at the Chiefs, and the Dolphins would destroy the Chiefs in the same way that the Ravens would do. Followed by the Eagles beating the Giants in their rematch. And what hell of a divisional matchup we would start off with, as the Dolphins are at the Ravens, a rematch from earlier in the year in what would look like a defensive struggle. Ends up being a rout for Baltimore, as the Dolphins' Matt Ryan struggles against that really good Ravens defense like he did against the Packers in real life in the divisional round, and the Ravens once again beat the Dolphins. After that, it would be the Falcons now at the Saints. What hell of a matchup this would be, as both teams won at home in very close games between each other, and just like in the two matchups, this game would go right down to the wire, and the Falcons, one more drive, needed one more score to possibly win it. Josh Freeman leads them downfield and ends up pulling off the upset and beats the Saints on the road, and with that, the Falcons are in the NFC Championship for the first time in 6 years. Followed by the Eagles losing to the Packers and the Patriots beating the Steelers in defensive struggle. The AFC Championship is now the Ravens at the Patriots, and like I said before, I think the Ravens easily could beat the Patriots in Foxborough during those times, as all those games were really close, and I think this time around the Ravens would get it in their rematch from earlier in the year. And with that, the NFC Championship is now the Falcons at the Packers. Could the Falcons actually go all the way to the Super Bowl with Josh Freeman leading the comeback? Unfortunately, not this time around, as on the road against a very good Packers team who they have not played, and they struggled, remember, when they played in the playoffs with Matt Ryan. Now they're at Lambeau Field in the cold and snow possibly. Oh no. Josh Freeman would struggle in that regard, and the Packers would still go on to make it to the Super Bowl. Super Bowl 45 is now the Ravens and the Packers. However, I think in the end, since the Ravens were pretty much the same team as the Steelers, the Packers would probably win in the exact same fashion as they did in our timeline against the Steelers. It's now 2011, and the Buccaneers still desperately, badly need their franchise quarterback, especially now that their defense looks really good, that they can maybe start making a playoff push next year. However, unfortunately for them, they got better at a very bad time, as the Panthers still end up with getting Cam Newton, so they lost their chance of getting the best quarterback. Now, of course, the 2011 draft had 3 other quarterbacks that were taken in the first round, although all of them busted out, but they still take one anyway, and unfortunately for them, it would be the worst bust of them all, Blaine Gabbert, which of course means what would happen with the Jaguars since they can't draft him anymore. I think they probably would just stick with David Garrard for the year. Once again, just like in 2009, the Dolphins have Super Bowl aspirations again after that incredible season that fell short in the divisional round. However, the team struggled at the very beginning of the year. Their defense wasn't as good, and Matt Ryan had once again regressed in year 4. However, later on in the year, the defense really stiffened up, and Matt Ryan played much better, and the Dolphins salvaged their terrible start to the year, ended up only finishing 10-6, but that would still be enough to make the playoffs. Down in Atlanta, Josh Freeman-led Falcons also have Super Bowl aspirations after the incredible season they had the year before. They start off good, however, later on in the year, the Falcons begin to fall apart, as Josh Freeman becomes a turnover machine to likes that even Chad Henne's starting to look a lot better in comparison. In the end, the Falcons regress as they finished 8-8 and missed the playoffs. And then down in Tampa Bay, the Buccaneers, with their new quarterback in Blaine Gabbert, hope that they could finally make a playoff appearance after 4 years. However, it is a complete shit show, as Blaine Gabbert is awful, pure awful, and the defense that was awesome last year does not play at the same level as they did in 2010, and the Buccaneers once again regress as they finish 3-13 and one of the worst teams in the league. Pretty subtle changes in the 2011 bracket, as the Chargers now get the 4th seed in the playoffs, and the Dolphins manage to sneak in as the 6th seed. Meanwhile, on the NFC side, the Lions now move up to the 5th seed, as the Bears manage to get in as the 6th seed. For the wild card round, first starting off with the Dolphins at the Texans. Even though the Texans were struggling with all their injuries, I think the momentum they had at that time would just be too much for the Dolphins, who they did beat earlier in the year when they visited them. So despite that strong momentum, the Dolphins are one and done in the playoffs, followed by the Saints destroying the Bears. And then in an offensive shootout, I think the Lions would beat the Eagles in Philadelphia, and then the Steelers would destroy the Chargers in the wild card round. The Patriots, Ravens, Packers, and 49ers would all win their games still in the divisional round. So the conference championship is now the Ravens at Patriots once again, and just like I said earlier, I think the Ravens would still once again beat the Patriots and defy the odds that happen in our timeline and win it once again to make it back to the Super Bowl, followed by the Packers beating the 49ers too. So the Super Bowl is once again the Ravens and the Packers once again. This time around, I think the Ravens with the revenge. Although Joe Flacco did not play as good this year, I still think the Ravens overall were better in 2011 than 2010. The Packers, although their offense was elite that year, their defense was kind of messed up. And when they played a really good defense, they kind of struggled. So this time around, I think the Ravens would get it and get their second Super Bowl. It's now 2012, and of course, there are two big things to talk about in the upcoming draft. Of course, Andrew Luck and RG3. This time around, it's the Rams that has the #1 overall pick, and the Colts have the 2nd overall pick. And just like in our timeline, the Rams would still make their trade with the Redskins, who they now take Andrew Luck in the draft. Meanwhile, the Colts would take RG3 instead. Funny enough how that swapped around. Meanwhile, another quarterback to look at is Ryan Tannehill, who was the quarterback that the Dolphins originally took in the 2012 draft. But since they got Matt Ryan now, they have no need for him. So where would he go? Looking at the draft, I think he would fall to the Cardinals. So now the Cardinals hope they finally got their quarterback of the future that Matt Leinart could not be. In 2012, Matt Ryan and the Dolphins would play much better. The defense would still play really good, and he would have another Pro Bowl season. However, they did not get a good schedule that kind of hurt them in terms of some of the wins that they could not get compared to like they did in 2010. So in the end, they only ended up improving to 11-5, which doesn't look that really good, but the team is much better than that though. Meanwhile, down in Atlanta, the Falcons got off to a really hot start thanks to Josh Freeman having a really good season. Honestly, statistically almost better than his 2010 season, although the team did fall off a little bit near the end of the year as Freeman started to become like a turnover machine again. But in the end, the Falcons surprised the league once again as they finished 12-4 and in the tops of the NFC bracket in the playoffs. The Buccaneers still, once again, nothing is going their way as they regress once again and finish 2-14. Meanwhile, in Landover, the Redskins, now with Andrew Luck, plays really well. However, he did not have the offensive performance, of course, that RG3 provided in his rookie season. But in the end, that would actually be enough for the Redskins as they not only make their incredible run to the playoffs, they actually play better in this timeline as they finished 11-5. Meanwhile, out in Indianapolis, RG3 and the Colts are cooking up the AFC side, as with RG3, the Colts played much better offensively, and they ended up finishing 12-4 and looking really scary in the playoffs. There are huge changes on the 2012 playoff bracket. In the AFC side, the Texans now move up to the #2 seed as the Ravens move up to the 3rd seed. The Dolphins this time finally win the AFC East as they get up to the 4th seed, and the Patriots fall all the way down to the 6th seed. In the NFC side, it's now the Vikings with the #1 overall seed, as the Falcons are now #2, they fall down a bit. The 49ers fall to the 3rd seed, and the Packers fall to the 6th seed. The NFC side's wildcard round will remain the same as our timeline. Meanwhile, in the AFC side, it would start off with the Patriots at the Ravens, and the Ravens would once again beat the Patriots like they did earlier in the year and in the AFC Championship in our timeline. Then the next day, it would be the RG3-led Colts visiting Matt Ryan and the Dolphins, as this could be one hell of an exciting game. However, RG3 struggles in this game. On the road against the Dolphins, whose stingy defense and the defense of the Colts not being that good yet, as Matt Ryan would torch them. In the end, the Dolphins would win in a pretty much rout. Now the divisional round is where things get very interesting, as now the Dolphins visit the Broncos, and oh boy, just like the Ravens did in our timeline, I think the Dolphins could go up there and beat the Broncos and one and done, as their offense was better than the Ravens in this timeline now with Matt Ryan, and their defense was just as good. And with that, the Dolphins are finally back in the AFC Championship after 20 years away. Followed by the 49ers still beating the Falcons in the divisional round like they did in the NFC Championship. And then it's the Seahawks at the Vikings, as the upstart Seahawks visit the Vikings. They played each other in real life when Seattle hosted them, and the Seahawks beat them. However, at this point, the Seahawks really were on a roll at this point. Even though the Vikings themselves had won 4 games that finished off the year at this point, I don't think they could keep up with the momentum with the Seahawks, and the Seahawks knock off the #1 seed like they almost did in real life against the Falcons, followed by the Texans still destroying the Ravens like I've mentioned before in previous series. The NFC Championship is now the Seahawks at the 49ers, as these two played each other early in the year on Thursday night, with the 49ers barely beating the Seahawks too in that game. However, remember at the same time, this was before Colin Kaepernick was the starter. Alex Smith was the starter of that game, and this was also before the Seahawks became the juggernaut Super Bowl contender that they were near the end of 2012. I could easily say the Seahawks might actually get this win, but I think the 49ers just might hold on and beat the Seahawks to make it back to the Super Bowl still. And follow that would be the Dolphins at the Texans in the AFC Championship. The Dolphins lost to the Texans earlier in the year. However, they have the momentum on their side. They're playing better. The Texans are struggling, and they're a much better team right now. And this time, I think the Dolphins would do it. They would finally beat the Texans in the playoffs, and with that, they are finally in the Super Bowl, as Super Bowl 47 is now the Dolphins and 49ers, the rematch of 28 years earlier. And this game would probably go as it did in our timeline with the Ravens and 49ers. However, the 49ers playing really good against Matt Ryan, I think that would negate them a little bit in the end. So in the end, I think the Dolphins would probably get the same, well, not as big of a lead as the Ravens did in our timeline, but I think the Dolphins would still get a pretty big lead. But this time around, the 49ers actually make the comeback and pull it off, and the 49ers would get their 6th title, as the Dolphins fall short of their first title in 39 years. And that's where I'll end my theory off for now. So now for the recap. The Cardinals, of course, who knows what will happen once Ryan Tannehill gets better. Maybe this team would be scary in 2014 and 15 like they were with Carson Palmer and that very good defense, but who knows. The RG3-led Colts, of course, would fall off and never be as scary as they were in 2012 before he would probably be released with his injuries. Andrew Luck and the Redskins, however, would probably be all over the place. A team missing the playoffs, being right there in the playoff mix, making the playoffs, and possibly being a Super Bowl contender. It would all depend upon what year that this team plays in. The Buccaneers would continue to regress in 2013. They would finally get rid of Blaine Gabbert. Perhaps they would be bad enough that they might be able to take Blake Bortles, Johnny Manziel, or Teddy Bridgewater, perhaps, depending on who they take. Oh boy, that's a lot of asking for. Followed by Jaguars, probably finally getting their quarterback in 2014 as well, as there was no good quarterback in 2013. So they might end up with Blake Bortles, or perhaps get Johnny Manziel or Teddy Bridgewater instead. The Falcons would fall apart just like they did in our timeline 2013 with Josh Freeman. However, Freeman, of course, since he led the Falcons to the playoffs twice now, he actually could possibly still stay on the team in 2014. And if he does, the Falcons would fall apart that year. And maybe if they would have a bad enough pick where they might end up with either Jameis Winston or Marcus Mariota in 2015. But then, of course, the main team, the Dolphins. After falling short of the Super Bowl, the Dolphins would fall apart in 2013 with the hangover as they struggled that year, especially with Matt Ryan. However, the next year, they would be very scary with a much better offensive power with Matt Ryan and Ryan Tannehill in 2014. However, after a terrible 2015, perhaps in 2016, the Dolphins could be very scary with that 10-6 record, and then with Matt Ryan with that powerful MVP season, the Dolphins could easily make a Super Bowl run. And then who knows what will happen after that. I am actually very curious to see what would happen if I come back to this theory later on down the line. But that's going to end it off here. In the end, the Dolphins would be in a much better situation with Matt Ryan instead of if they took Jake Long, as they would make the playoffs 4 times in this timeline instead of just 1. They would win the AFC East twice instead of 1 time, and they would make the Super Bowl, unlike our timeline, along with winning 4 playoff games, which, unlike real life where they haven't won one since 2000. And meanwhile, of course, for the Falcons, although they still would make the playoffs twice and make it to an NFC Championship appearance still, yeah, they're nowhere near as good unless they had Matt Ryan. But hey, it's just a theory, an NFL theory. Thanks for watching. Sorry it took almost 2 bumps to get to this, as I had a whole bunch of crap to deal with, as the next video will be very interesting, and thankfully not as long, but it will be very in-depth and very interesting to talk about, as it's one of the most talked about theories of like the late 90s, early 2000s. So see you guys then.